welcome back. President Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness plan was blocked by the Supreme Court, which would have provided up to $20,000 of relief to struggling borrowers, causing a significant setback for many people across the country. To discuss the implications of this decision for millions facing student loan debt, we have Jacob Channel, an economist at LendingTree and a student loan expert, joining us for a discussion. Jacob, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this feels like a never-ending situation, and there's been so many things that have changed. But for those who haven't been following, can you just give us some insight on the previous battles with student loan forgiveness?
Sure. So, student loans have been a part of American politics for quite some time now, going back to the early 1900s and the 60s, if you want to talk about federally backed student loans. And more recently, in the last decade or so, there's been a really big push toward broad student loan forgiveness. Now, student loan forgiveness that's more targeted has existed for decades before that. Certainly, there were laws or things in the 1990s, for example, that made it easier for teachers to discharge student loans. But this kind of thrust for broad student loan forgiveness has really picked up steam more recently, largely because more people are going to college now. There's more of an emphasis put on going to college, and more people, unfortunately, are also graduating with student loan debt. So in a nutshell, what's kind of happened recently is that President Biden, when he was campaigning, he said he'd think about maybe proposing broad student loan forgiveness. Once he was elected, he followed through with that. And he, as you pointed out, tried to forgive up to $20,000 for certain borrowers. And, it's been sort of a long back and forth, as I'm sure anyone with student loans can tell you, without meaning to say so. And unfortunately, it ended up at the Supreme Court, where they very recently, in the last few weeks, struck it down.
Now, as mentioned, the Supreme Court ruled the Biden administration overstepped its authority in trying to cancel or reduce student loans for millions of people. Can you just explain, what does this mean, or how did they come to this conclusion?
Yeah, so the thing that it means for most people is, at least as of right now, most people are not going to get student loan forgiveness. So whatever debt you currently owe is likely going to have to be the debt that you pay back. Now, I do want to point out that there are still more targeted student loan forgiveness programs available, just as there are more targeted income-driven repayment plans available. So, student loan forgiveness isn't completely gone away. Some people, for example, teachers at low-income schools, or people who work for nonprofits or the government, or folks who are permanently disabled, can still potentially get access to, again, more targeted student loan forgiveness. That said, the broad student loan forgiveness could happen in the future, though this recent ruling from the Supreme Court, basically in a nutshell, what they said is that while the president and the Department of Education may have the authority to modify student loans in some way, they essentially don't have absolute authority. So in other words, they might be able to offer an income-driven repayment plan, but that doesn't mean that they can automatically cancel student loan debt for tens of millions of Americans across the country. You can debate the merits of that case. You can debate the merits of their ruling, whether or not they should have even been ruling in this in the first place. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court is the highest authority on the law in the land. And so without congressional action, this seems pretty unlikely to go forward, at least in the near future.
Now, the court basically believes that the administration needs Congress endorsement before undertaking a costly program. Can you just explain why this is viewed as a costly issue for, Congress or the court?
Yeah, so, it's important to point out that this broad student loan forgiveness didn't cancel all student loans, nor did it apply to everyone. It was targeted to folks who in 2020 or 2021 made less than $125,000 and who had federally backed student loans, and they could get $10,000 or $20,000 worth of their debt forgiven, depending on whether or not they had a Pell Grant while in school. And usually Pell Grants are given out to folks from lower income families. That said, we're talking about tens of millions of people across the country. This program could have cost upwards of, I think, $400 billion or so. You don't need an economist to tell you that $400 billion is, as it turns out, a very large amount of money, surprisingly. So, it is something that there was concern about that. And there is, certainly some concern about maybe the president by himself saying, hey, I'm going to go spend $400 billion. Now, of course, there is a lot of nuance. It's worth pointing out that other things the government does cost considerably more than what this forgiveness would have cost. It's worth pointing out that while this would have cost a lot of money, it probably could have saved even more money in the long term, probably could have resulted in more stimulation of the economy. So it's not entirely cut and dry. But again, regardless of how anyone personally feels about it, in this case, the opinions that really matter are those of the 5 Supreme Court justices who ruled this unconstitutional and, in effect, stopped it in its tracks.
Now, in regard to this situation, people opposed to student loan forgiveness brought up the HEROES Act. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the HEROES Act was passed in, I believe 2003, and it essentially gives Congress or gives the Department of Education the ability to modify student loans in response to a national emergency or something like a war. So in 2003, the thing that was on everyone's mind was, of course, 9/11. And so this time we didn't have an act of terrorism that caused national emergency. We had the COVID-19 pandemic, which, again, I'm sure we all will probably vividly remember in ways that we wish we could forget. Nonetheless, the Department of Education, the Biden administration looked at the HEROES Act, which, by the way, was used in part to extend the student loan payment pause, which is rapidly coming to an end. It's not what started the payment pause, but it was the thing that gave the Department of Education, the authority, rather, to continue that payment pause, to continue the interest pause. So it was being actively used. It's just in this instance, the Biden administration tried to use it a little bit more actively. And while the legislation does give the Department of Education some leeway when it comes to modifying student loans, the Supreme Court ultimately decided it doesn't give them enough leeway to broadly cancel student loans.
Now, you mentioned that President Biden has made an effort to cancel student loans. However, there are advocacy groups that, are still pushing for this and saying that he can do more. I kind of want to dissect this a little bit. Is there room to do that after this decision?
Well, to the Biden administration's kind of credit, something that I'm sure the advocates would be very thrilled to know is that they're still trying. So now the Biden administration, they're going to go forward and try broad student loan forgiveness, citing authority from a different act, the Higher Education Act, which was passed in the 60s. Now, with that said, as we've been talking about, the fact of the matter is the Supreme Court seems pretty hostile to this kind of thing being done by executive action. Personally, I'm very skeptical that they'll suddenly change their tune just because the Biden administration is citing a different law, but trying to ultimately do basically the exact same thing. Again, you can really debate the merits of this. I'm sure there are plenty of law professors out there and a lot of individual people who truly believe that the president has the authority to do this, that the Supreme Court is wrong in their decision. But ultimately, based on their most recent ruling, based on how generally hostile they seem to this being done by executive action, personally, and I know people don't want to hear this, but personally, I wouldn't get my hopes up that we'll see broad forgiveness anytime soon, certainly not without an act of Congress, which, right now Congress is pretty divided, so that doesn't seem particularly likely, at least not in the near future. Does that mean it's impossible? Absolutely not. I do hope that one day Congress does act, or maybe Supreme Court sometime in the future does say the president has the authority to do this. But that's the future. And in the present, it seems like this probably isn't going to come to fruition anytime soon.
When will loan repayments resume?
So loan repayments are going to resume on October 1st. The Biden administration has pushed back this date a few times, as did the Trump administration. Though owing to the legislation passed to raise the debt ceiling, which you may remember from a few months ago, that can no longer be done. So come hell or high water, payments are resuming on October 1st. Interest is going to start being collected again on September 1st. Now, there is one caveat that's worth pointing out. While payments are resuming on October 1st, there is going to be a 12-month grace period where missed payments, they're not paused, your loans are still going to collect interest, but where missed payments aren't going to be reported to credit rating agencies. So in other words, you'll have some leeway to maybe miss a few payments here or there. Your interest will continue to collect, your loan will get bigger, but at least for about a year, your credit score won't take a hit. So there is a little bit of a silver lining, though. Again, payments are resuming on October 1st. Do not count on that being pushed off again.
So we have a few months until October. What are some ways people can prepare?
So, what's actually kind of fun is that, earlier, about half an hour ago on this very show, you had somebody from AARP kind of coming out and saying, here are some ways to save. And I know people often talk about AARP is for older folks. Well, the truth is that I read a lot of those saving tips that they gave. They apply to pretty much everyone. So, one way is to really just start saving, preparing, putting that money aside so that you can make your student loans. That could mean cutting back on other things like eating out or using coupons at the grocery store so you've got more money left over to make your student loans. So that's really the big thing. You really want to be sitting down right now, as you're watching this, logging into your student loan account, figuring out how much you owe. A lot of people haven't made a payment since March of 2020, so they might have forgotten. So refamiliarize yourself with where you stand and then start budgeting. And if you are in a situation where you're saying, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this, get in touch with the Department of Education or your student loan service provider right away. There are still programs, as I mentioned earlier, for more targeted forgiveness. There are programs for income-driven repayment plans that exist. Not everyone will qualify for these programs. However, they can be a really significant help to the folks who do, specifically lower income folks. So really, in a nutshell, what I'm saying is be as proactive as possible right now. Don't wait until October 1st to start thinking about your student loan payment, because that's probably just going to make your life a whole heck of a lot more difficult than it needs to be.
Well, Jacob, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion.
Yes, I wish we were here to talk about better news, but I'm happy to be here regardless.
To keep up with any updates regarding the student debt relief fight, please go to www.studentaid.gov. We have to take a quick break. We will be back with more Open right after this.